June 1944. The Pacific Ocean was a vast blue chessboard, and for 3 years, the Empire of Japan and the United States had been trading pawns. They had fought in the fever swamps of Guadalcanal, the coral abattoir of Tarawa, and the blinding sands of the Gilberts. But those were outer defenses. They were outposts. Now, the American war machine was staring at something different. It was staring at the absolute national defense sphere. This was the inner ring. If the Americans breached this line, the war would no longer be fought on distant, nameless atolls. It would be brought to the doorsteps of Tokyo, and the lock on this door was the island of Saipan. To the Japanese High Command, Saipan was not just an island. It was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It was the jewel of the Marianas, a fortress of limestone mountains, deep caves, and razor-sharp coral reefs that had been under Japanese control since World War I. They had had decades to study every inch of the terrain, to sight every artillery gun, and to turn the geography itself into a weapon. The garrison commander, Lieutenant General Yoshisugu Saito, was a man of the old school, confident, rigid, and absolutely certain of the superiority of the Japanese spirit over the material wealth of the Americans. Saito looked at his defenses and felt secure. He had nearly 32,000 troops at his disposal, including the elite naval landing forces commanded by the hero of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo. He had tanks. He had heavy artillery tucked into the reverse slopes of the mountains where naval gunfire couldn't reach them. But his greatest ally, he believed, was the water itself. Saipan was surrounded by a barrier reef, a jagged wall of coral that sat hundreds of yards offshore. To land on Saipan, the Americans would have to cross this reef, wade through deep lagoons, and then hit the beaches which had been pre-registered by every mortar and machine gun on the island. In Tokyo, General Tojo, the Prime Minister, assured the Emperor that Saipan was impregnable. He claimed that any American attempt to take the island would result in a slaughter so horrific that the American public would lose the stomach for the war. They believed that the Americans were soft, that they relied too heavily on their machines, and that they would break against the spiritual fortress of the Marianas. The plan was simple: destroy the enemy at the water's edge. Don't let them get a foothold. Bleed them in the lagoon until the water turns red, and then push the survivors back into the sea. But General Saito had made a fatal miscalculation. He was preparing to fight the American Navy of 1942, a force that was learning and stumbling. He did not understand that he was about to face the American Navy of 1944, an industrial monster that had solved the riddle of amphibious warfare. On the morning of June 15th, 1944, the horizon vanished. The Japanese sentries peering out from their bunkers on the beaches of Chiran Kanoa saw something that defied logic. The ocean was gone, replaced by gray steel. An armada of 535 ships lay offshore. It was a fleet so massive that it stretched as far as the eye could see. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire, unleashing a bombardment that shook the limestone foundations of the island. The earth erupted. Palm trees were snapped like matchsticks. The noise was a continuous, deafening roar that bled from the ears of the defenders. Saito and his staff huddled in their command post, waiting for the shelling to stop. They knew this game. The Americans would shell them, and then they would send in the landing craft, the Higgins boats. These boats had a weakness. They couldn't cross the reef. The Americans would have to transfer to wading, exposing themselves to the Japanese guns. Saito ordered his artillery to hold fire. "Wait," he told his men. "Wait until they are stuck on the reef. Then we kill them all." At 0800 hours, the shelling shifted inland. The signal was given. The invasion began. But as the first wave of American assault vehicles approached the reef, the Japanese gunners froze. These weren't the flat-bottomed Higgins boats they expected. These were Amtraks, landing vehicle tracked, LVTs. They were ugly, boxy, amphibious tractors with tank tracks that could churn through water and grip onto solid coral. The Japanese watched in horror as the American vehicles didn't stop at the reef. They didn't unload their men into the deep water. The LVTs simply crawled up onto the coral, their tracks grinding over the barrier, and kept coming. They churned through the lagoon, a mechanical swarm of 700 vehicles kicking up white wakes, driving straight for the beach. The speed was terrifying. The Japanese doctrine relied on the Americans being slow, vulnerable, and wading through chest-deep water. Instead, they were facing a mechanized stampede. At 0840, the first LVT hit the sand, then another, then 100 more. The ramps dropped, or the Marines vaulted over the sides. In the span of 20 minutes, 8,000 United States Marines were ashore. It was a logistical miracle. It was a feat of coordination that the world had never seen. In less time than it takes to eat breakfast, the Americans had put the population of a small town onto a hostile beach 6,000 miles from home. The impenetrable barrier of the reef had been crossed, as if it wasn't even there. The Japanese commanders, watching from the high ground, were stunned. Their water's edge strategy had evaporated in a cloud of diesel fumes and American efficiency. But getting ashore was one thing. Staying alive was another. The moment the LVTs hit the sand, General Saito played his hand. He gave the order to fire. The silence of the Japanese positions was broken by a storm of steel. The Japanese had placed colored flags on the beach to mark the range for their mortars and howitzers. As the Marines crowded onto the narrow strip of sand, the shells began to fall with terrifying accuracy. The beach at Saipan became a slaughterhouse. The sand, white and pristine moments before, turned black with soot and red with blood. The noise was a physical weight, a chaotic symphony of exploding mortar rounds, the zip of Nambu machine gun fire, and the screams of, "Corpsmen! Corpsmen!" For the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions, the miracle landing instantly turned into a fight for survival. They were pinned down. The Japanese were firing from the tree line, from bunkers hidden in the sand dunes, and from the high ground of Mount Fina Susu. The LVTs that had brought them ashore were being blown apart. Burning vehicles littered the waterline, their black smoke mixing with the dust of the bombardment. Sergeants grabbed terrified privates by the collars, screaming at them to get off the beach. "Move or die! Move or die!" The Marines pushed forward, crawling over the bodies of their friends, throwing grenades into the Japanese bunkers. It was savage, close-quarters combat. Flamethrowers were brought up to burn out the pillboxes. The air smelled of roasting flesh and cordite. Despite the chaos, despite the horrific casualties, the sheer weight of the American landing could not be stopped. They kept coming. Wave after wave of men and supplies poured onto the beachhead. By the end of the day, 20,000 Marines were ashore. They had carved out a beachhead, shallow and precarious, but it was theirs. They dug in, scraping foxholes in the sandy soil, setting up their machine guns, waiting for the night. Because they knew the night belonged to the Japanese. General Saito knew he had lost the battle for the beach. The Americans were ashore. But he still believed he could win the battle for the island. He looked at the huddled masses of Marines, their backs to the sea, disorganized and shaken by the landing. He saw an opportunity. He would do what the Japanese army did best. He would launch a massive, coordinated night counterattack. He would drive a wedge through their lines and push them back into the ocean. As the sun set over the Philippine Sea, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined palms, the Japanese troops began to assemble. They strapped bayonets to their rifles. They tied flags to their bayonets. They drank sake. They prepared to die for the emperor. This wasn't just a tactical maneuver. It was a spiritual cleansing. They were going to wash the stain of the American landing away with blood. Down on the beach, the Marines waited. They fired flares into the sky, the drifting parachutes casting eerie, shifting light over the landscape. They listened. At first, there was only the sound of the surf and the groans of the wounded. Then they heard it. The sound of bugles, the sound of chanting, the sound of thousands of men screaming, "Banzai!" The first night on Saipan erupted into madness. The Japanese hit the Marine lines like a human tidal wave. They didn't use cover, they charged straight into the machine guns. But this time, they weren't just infantry. Saito sent his tanks. The Type 97 Chiha tanks clanked out of the darkness, their guns flashing. The Marines, many of whom had never seen a Japanese tank before, scrambled for their bazookas. The fighting disintegrated into a confusing melee. It was hand-to-hand in the foxholes. Marines used entrenching tools and K-bar knives against samurai swords and bayonets. The darkness was lit up by the tracers and the explosions of satchel charges. But the impenetrable defense was failing. The Japanese tanks were too light. The American bazookas and 37mm anti-tank guns ripped them apart. The Banzai charge, terrifying as it was, broke against the discipline of the Marines. The Americans didn't run. They held their ground, firing until their barrels glowed red-hot, stacking the Japanese dead in windrows in front of their positions. By dawn on June 16th, the counterattack was broken. The beach was secure.
The Americans weren't going anywhere. General Saito, watching from his mountain command post, realized with a cold dread that the premise of his defense had been flawed. The Americans were not soft. They were not brittle. And they had brought a level of violence that his spiritual fortress could not withstand. The landing was over. The battle for the beaches was won. But looming over the Marines was the true nightmare of Saipan. The high ground. Mount Tapachao. The purple, jagged spine of the island looked down on them, honeycombed with caves, bristling with artillery, and defended by 25,000 Japanese soldiers who had nowhere to retreat and no intention of surrendering. The Marines had landed 8,000 men in an hour, a feat that stunned the world. But now, they would have to pay for every inch of the ground ahead with blood. The easy part was over. The Valley of Hell awaited them. The beaches were secure, but safety was an illusion. As the Americans pushed inland, leaving the black sands of the landing zone behind, they looked up. Looming over them was the spine of the island, a jagged limestone nightmare dominated by Mount Tapachao. To the Marines, it looked like a prehistoric monster waiting to devour them. To General Saito and his remaining forces, it was the castle. And they had turned every inch of it into a killing zone. The battle for Saipan now shifted from a rapid amphibious assault to a grinding, claustrophobic siege. The Japanese doctrine of defense had evolved. They no longer relied solely on the Banzai charge to clear the enemy. Instead, they burrowed. The geology of Saipan was honeycombed with natural caves and ravines, and the Japanese engineers had connected them with tunnels. They created spider holes, camouflaged pits where a single soldier could pop up, fire a Nambu machine gun, and vanish back into the earth before the Marines could locate him. For the Americans, the advance became a game of corkscrew and blowtorch. It was brutal, intimate work. A Marine squad would approach a cave entrance, taking heavy fire. They couldn't shoot the enemy because the enemy was around a corner deep inside the rock. So they would call up the flamethrowers. A Marine with a heavy tank of napalm on his back would brave the bullets, step up to the mouth of the cave, and unleash a stream of liquid fire. The roar was terrifying, sucking the oxygen out of the air. Then, the demolition teams would rush in, tossing satchel charges of high explosives to collapse the entrance, sealing the defenders inside forever. They did this once. Then they did it again. And again. Hundreds of times. Yard by bloody yard,
they climbed the slopes of Mount Tapachau. The fighting in the center of the island, a place the Americans christened Death Valley, was particularly savage. On one side stood Purple Heart Ridge, a steep cliff face infested with Japanese snipers. On the other was Hell's Pocket. The Marines and soldiers of the U.S. Army's 27th Division were caught in a crossfire that seemed to have no source. Men would drop mid-stride, shot by invisible enemies. Tanks would explode, hit by anti-tank guns rolled out of caves on railroad tracks, and then rolled back in. The casualty rates were appalling. Companies were reduced to platoons. Platoons were reduced to squads. But the relentless pressure of the American industrial machine was crushing the Japanese defenders. The Americans had total air superiority. P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead, dropping napalm and bombs on anything that moved. Offshore, the battleships Tennessee and California hurled 14-inch shells into the mountains, pulverizing the rock. Saito's forces were being bled white. They had no food. They had no water. Their ammunition was dwindling to nothing. By early July, the 30,000 defenders had been reduced to a few thousand desperate men, cornered on the northern tip of the island. In the caves of the north, the conditions were apocalyptic. The Japanese soldiers were starving, rotting from gangrene, and mad with thirst. General Saito, the man who had promised to push the Americans into the sea, sat in his command cave, an old, broken man. He knew the end had come. He enjoyed a final ritual meal of crab meat and sake, the last of his supplies. Then he issued his final order. It was an order that would result in one of the most horrifying spectacles of the Pacific War. "There is no longer any distinction between civilians and soldiers," he wrote. "It would be better to die to the last man than to be captured." On the morning of July 6th, Saito walked to a flat rock in his cave, sat down facing north towards the emperor, and committed seppuku, slicing his own stomach open before his adjutant shot him in the head. But his death was not the end. It was the signal. What happened next on the morning of July 7th, 1944, defies modern comprehension. The Americans, believing the battle was mostly over, were resting in their foxholes near the village of Tanapag. The 105th Infantry Regiment was holding the line. At 0400 hours, the ground began to shake. It wasn't artillery. It was feet. Out of the pre-dawn mist surged the largest Gyokusai, suicide charge of the entire war. It was a tidal wave of humanity. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers poured down the slopes. But these weren't fresh troops. These were the walking dead. Men hobbled on crutches. Men with no weapons wrapped bayonets to bamboo sticks. Some had no arms, only grenades strapped to their chests. Some were bandaged from head to toe, blind, guided by their comrades. They were led by officers waving swords, screaming, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor. They hit the American lines with the force of a tsunami. The sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed the forward positions. The Americans fired their machine guns until the barrels melted. They fired their artillery at point-blank range, the fuses set to 0 delay, turning the shells into giant shotguns.
But the Japanese kept coming. They climbed over the piles of their own dead to get to the Americans. The battle disintegrated into a medieval melee. It was rocks against helmets, teeth against fists. In the chaos, heroes were born and died in seconds. This was the moment of Captain Ben Solomon, the battalion dentist. Yes, a dentist. When the Japanese overran the aid station, Solomon didn't run. He grabbed an M1 rifle and killed the first soldier who burst in, bayoneting the wounded. Then he manned a machine gun. He ordered the medics to evacuate the wounded while he held the door. When they found his body days later, he was slumped over the gun, dead, surrounded by 98 enemy bodies. He had single-handedly held back the tide to save his patients. The charge lasted for hours.
It was a massacre of biblical proportions. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the Japanese force had been annihilated. The field in front of Tanapag was a carpet of bodies, so thick you could walk for hundreds of yards without touching the ground. The impenetrable garrison of Saipan had spent itself in one final, futile gesture of defiance. But the horror of Saipan had one final, darker chapter to write. With the military resistance crushed, the surviving Japanese civilians, thousands of men, women, and children who had lived on the island, retreated to the northernmost cliffs at Marpi Point. They had been told by their military leaders that the Americans were monsters. They had been told the Marines would rape the women, eat the children, and crush the men under tanks. They believed that death was the only escape from the American devils. The Marines reached the cliffs and stopped. They looked across a gap of a few hundred yards and saw the civilians huddled on the precipice, 800 feet above the churning rocks of the ocean. The Americans brought up loudspeakers. They brought up Japanese-American translators. "Don't jump," they pleaded. "We have food. We have water. We will not hurt you."
The Marines watched, helpless, tears streaming down their faces as the tragedy unfolded. They saw mothers combing their daughters' hair for the last time. They saw families holding hands. They saw fathers tossing their infants over the edge before jumping after them. It was a waterfall of suicide. The sea below turned pink with blood. American patrol boats raced to the base of the cliffs, trying to fish survivors out of the water. But many of the Japanese refused to be saved, diving under the water to drown themselves rather than be touched by American hands. It was a scene of mass psychosis, a testament to the power of propaganda and the utter ruthlessness of the Japanese military code. Of the 25,000 civilians on Saipan, thousands died on those cliffs. On July 9, 1944, the American flag was officially raised over Saipan. The cost had been staggering. The Americans suffered 14,000 casualties, with over 3,000 dead. The Japanese garrison of 30,000 men was virtually wiped out. Less than 1,000 prisoners were taken, most of them too wounded to kill themselves. The fall of Saipan sent a shockwave through Tokyo that shattered the government. When the news reached the capital, the facade of invincibility cracked. The absolute national defense sphere had been breached. General Tojo, the architect of the war, was forced to resign in disgrace. The Japanese leadership knew, in the quiet of their war rooms, that the war was lost. And they knew this because of what the Americans immediately began to do on Saipan. Even before the smoke had cleared, the Seabees, the Navy construction battalions, were at work. They weren't building resorts. They were bulldozing the coral. They were laying down massive, long runways. Saipan wasn't just an island. It was a launch pad. It was exactly 1,300 miles from Tokyo. That was the magic number. It was within the range of the new American terror weapon, the B-29 Superfortress. Within months, the skies over Saipan were filled with the roar of these silver giants. The Impenetrable island became the base for the greatest aerial armada in history. From the runways built on the blood of the Marines and the bones of the Japanese defenders, the B-29s launched the firebombing raids that would incinerate Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe. And finally, on an August morning 1 year later, a B-29 named Enola Gay would launch from a nearby island in the same chain to deliver the final blow. The Japanese commanders believed Saipan was a wall that would stop the Americans. They were wrong. It wasn't a wall. It was a door. And when the Marines kicked it open with 8,000 men in a single hour, they let in the whirlwind that would burn the Empire of Japan to the ground. The tragedy of Saipan was not just the death of the men on the beach or the civilians on the cliffs. It was the realization that all that death, all that sacrifice, and all that defiance served only to bring the end of the world one step closer to home.